Over the last few months, as occasionally a very obscure topic, politics, comes up, I've pointed out to people, both in this congregation and in Murfreesboro, that there are a lot of people who don't think the separation of church and state is a good idea. And people are generally very surprised to hear this. So I thought this would be part, and indeed it's going to be more than just part, it's going to be a good chunk of what I talk about today. The title is The Politics of Religion. And it's very important to understand why this wall separating church from state is so essential. And also take a look at why some people think not only is it not essential, but it's counterproductive. And we are seeing this play out right now, even in our state, in Tennessee. For instance, there was an effort to make the Bible the official state book. And it passed, but was vetoed by the governor. And fortunately, it was not overridden. But it came that close. If the governor had signed it, it would have been law. In Tullahoma, the mayor, for the last 3 years, and by the way, the National Day of Prayer is coming up. I haven't seen any ads for one this year, but the last 3 years, our mayor sponsored and was advertised as sponsoring a day of prayer in which only Christians were allowed to pray. I know this because I spoke to him every year about this. I went in person to meet with him to point out how this was a terrible idea that you're endorsing one religion over the other, and his answer was, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. And so every year I make a point of asking him, are you allowing non-Christians to pray this year? Nope. So if you think that the separation between church and state is endorsed in Tullahoma, you're mistaken, because the mayor endorses Christians only prayer meetings. We've seen an array of laws that have been allowed or purported to allow, although some of them did not pass, depending on which state you're talking about, denying services to the LGBT community, or prohibiting people from using bathrooms based on their gender identity. And on and on and on it goes. One just passed that says counselors can turn away people if they disagree with their sexuality and send them to somebody else because they don't want to have to deal with helping someone who's gay and then suggesting anything that might promote gay marriage. And so they can just say, no, I don't want to deal with you, and turn you over to somebody else. And you may or may not agree with that law, but let's face it, all of these things are stemming from religious convictions of people, or purportedly. That's how it's always used, is this protection of religious rights or protection of religious freedoms. Just remember, there was a time when your religious beliefs included the fact, perhaps, that the white race is superior to all other races. People used the Bible to justify this, and they did it in my lifetime. I heard people using the Bible to justify this when I was in high school. So this isn't just ancient history. And if you're going to argue that your religious rights allow you to discriminate, why stop with gay people? Why not take it all the way back and discriminate against women and discriminate against all other races? And on the list goes, because religion has been used for this throughout history. But there's something else that's going on, and you may have seen this Bible verse, and if you haven't, now that I talk about it, you might see it come up since the day of prayer is fast approaching. It's a very famous verse dealing with prayer and allegedly how this prayer will help the United States of America. And this is the verse. It's from the Hebrew Bible, which Christians have renamed the Old Testament. 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people, who are called by my name, humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. So, does that sound familiar to anyone, or am I the only one who's familiar with this? There's a couple of hands sort of going up. Okay. Keep an eye out for that, because this verse is used oftentimes to argue that we need to pray for our country, and if we do, if we turn back to God, our country, the United States of America, will be blessed by God. The land will be healed. Now, not all Christians believe this. not even all conservative fundamentalist Christians believe this because they understand biblical context. But there are plenty who do. And this is the argument that's used, and I'm going to explain it to you now because understanding how the Bible is used in modern politics is very important because it's happening on a daily basis right now. Many fundamentalist Christians will use this verse to say that if America, which should be and must be a Christian nation, if Americans will do this, pray that God will make us a great nation and will heal our land again. But the problem is, to use this verse to pertain to the United States is bad hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is a fancy word meaning interpretation, usually used for interpretation of Scripture. If you don't interpret the Bible correctly, you can end up saying almost anything is biblical. But here's the real story behind this verse. King Solomon, who, by the way, was the son of King David, the famous King David, David who slew the giant Goliath. Okay, that David who was a man after God's own heart, according to the Bible. His son King Solomon had just finished building the first permanent temple for God. And Solomon was given this opportunity, this privilege, because David had been turned down by God. David desperately wanted to build this temple. He laid all the groundwork for it, but he wasn't allowed to build the temple. We see why in 1 Chronicles 22:7. David said to Solomon, "My son, I had intended to build a house to the name of the Lord my God, but the Lord came to me saying, 'You have shed much blood and waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name because you have shed so much blood on earth before me.'" So David, the man after God's own heart, fighting the wars God told him to fight, was no longer worthy to build the temple of God because he had fought in these wars and shed blood at God's command. But the blood was apparently only on David's hands, not God's, because the Bible is nothing if not filled to the brim with ironic instances like this. So David couldn't do it even though he had obeyed God because he had shed all this blood. So Solomon, who was not a warrior king, was able to build the temple. And when he had done this, at the temple dedication, he offers up a prayer. And it lays out a series of bad things that might happen to Israel if they turn away from God. And so this is Solomon's prayer. And he's talking to God, of course. "If your people Israel are defeated before an enemy because they have sinned against you, and they return to you and confess your name and pray and make supplications before you in this house," the temple, "then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel, and bring them back to the land which you have given to them and to their fathers." So, if they're defeated before an enemy because they've sinned against God, if you lose in battle, it's because you have sinned against God. He's saying if they come back and repent, please forgive them. Restore their land. When the heavens are shut up and there is no rain because they have sinned against you, and they pray toward this place and confess your name and turn from their sin when you afflict them, then hear in heaven and forgive their sin of your servants and your people Israel. Teach them a good way in which they should walk and send rain on your land. So if there's a drought, it's because they have sinned against God, and he's saying if they will turn back to you and pray to this temple, please restore the rain. He goes on to also talk about famine and pestilence and blight and mildew and locusts and grasshoppers. If enemies besiege them in the land of their cities, whatever plague or whatever sickness there is, please hear their prayer when they turn back to you. So all these bad things come when Israel sins against God, when they will repent by praying at this temple or towards this temple, please forgive them and restore them. He also prays for success in battle. When your people go out to battle against their enemies by whatever way you shall send them, and they pray to you towards this city which you have chosen, and the house which I have built for your name, then hear from heaven their prayer and supplication, and maintain their cause. So he also prays for victory in battle. So after this prayer, the temple was filled with the glory of God, and Solomon leads a sacrifice of 22,000 heads of cattle and 20,000 sheep. 42,000 animals were killed. The dedication goes on for 7 days because you aren't simply killing all these animals, you also have to offer them up as burnt offerings. Try to imagine being there and seeing this, if indeed it happened this way. After the festivities, God appeared to Solomon at night and says, and here's the key part, the key verse that's used to talk about America, is when God appears to Solomon at night after all these things have happened, the temple has been dedicated. God says, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. That's the temple he's talking about. If I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or I command the locusts to devour the land, or I send pestilence among my people, and my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, and I will hear from heaven and forgive their sin and will heal their land. So that's the verse. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayer offered in this place, the temple. For now I have chosen and consecrated this house, the temple, that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. So this verse, used so often to refer to the United States of America, comes from a promise made by God to Solomon after the dedication of the temple, a promise that applied to Israel and Israel alone. It does not apply to the United States of America. The United States of America is not mentioned in the Bible. As much as people would love for you to think this is true, it is not. Now, there are schools of Christianity that like to say that the modern Christian church has replaced Israel. And there's a whole theology along these lines where the promises made to Israel in the Old Testament now apply to the church, because the church is now God's chosen people. Christians are now God's chosen people. They have replaced the Jews because the Jews rejected the Messiah. Now, I'm not going to talk about that theology other than it is a well-established view within Christianity. It is not the only one within Christianity. There are plenty of Christians who don't hold to that and who understand that this verse applies to Israel. They understand the biblical context. They understand the history. So we cannot paint all of Christianity with one brush. But the politicians who are pushing all these laws to emphasize Christianity, I'm inclined to believe, largely think this way, that the promises apply to America today. You may have heard the phrase American exceptionalism. Christians often think it refers to exceptionalism because we are a Christian nation. And so this theology works its way into our politics, and that's why religion and politics are very much intertwined in our country, at least in certain parts of our country. Now, in case you're relatively new here, although none of you really are relatively new, but if you're not sure, I'm not saying that I think this really happened. I don't think God actually appeared to Solomon. In fact, archaeological evidence doesn't even support that Solomon or King David existed. There's nothing right now. It doesn't mean they didn't exist. We just don't know. What we have is stories, and that's it. So I don't want people going out of here thinking, oh, Doug thought God really said this and promised it to Solomon, but it just doesn't apply to America. I think it's a story, just as so much in the Bible is a story designed to teach a lesson or help Israel understand their place in the world. And again, to take something like this that is probably mythological and turn it into history and then apply it to politics and apply it to lawmaking is a very scary thing, really. You shouldn't be doing that, but it's done far too often. But even if you're willing, for the sake of argument, to accept that these passages are actual history, it's still hard to argue they apply to the United States. I just gave you the historical context. Very clearly, God says time and time and time again, my place, my city, right here, the temple. That's what the promise refers to. If my people who are called by my name humble themselves, refers to the Israelites, the Hebrews, not Americans. Now keep an eye out for that verse, see if you see it, now that I've talked about it. And if you do see it, remember it was a promise made to Solomon concerning Israel, not a promise made to American political and church leaders concerning our country. Such a conclusion, to quote from the car talk guys, is bogus. Well, Doug, this is all well and good, but surely no one of consequence believes this stuff today. Well, I guess it depends on whether you think our lawmakers are people of consequence. Why else would Tennessee lawmakers want to make the Bible the official state book? Because you know if that law had passed, they'd be in court having to fight it and spending lots of money to fight it. It doesn't accomplish anything. It wastes a lot of money, but it makes a statement. It makes a statement. And I wonder how many of the people who voted yes were thinking in their minds, this makes a statement to God. We are turning to you, God, in this time of great apostasy in our nation. We in Tennessee are turning to you by honoring your book, and we're going to make it the official book of Tennessee. I can't speak for the motives of every politician, but you got to believe at least some of them had that going through their head, because why else would you do it except to get votes, which that might be the reason too. But it doesn't do anything else other than incur a lot of cost. Now there are movements within fundamentalist Christianity. A couple of them are called the Dominionists and the Christian Reconstructionists. They openly and deliberately seek to make the United States an explicitly Christian nation. I'm going to read a passage from the Political Research Associates website. It's called Dominionism is the New Religious Freedom. And this one ties into our politics. It's by Frederick Clarkson, February 14th, 2016. Fairly recent. The two main schools of dominionist thought include Christian Reconstructionism, founded by the late R.J. Rushdoony, which advances the idea not only of the need for Christians of the right sort to dominate society, but institute and apply Old Testament biblical law. Now I will do a little parentheses here. I've read books by these authors years ago when I was still a Christian myself. I am very familiar with the Reconstructionist movement. None of this is exaggerated. Another closely related form of dominionism is advocated by the Pentecostal New Apostolic Reformation, which exuberantly advocates for Christians to reclaim the 7 mountains of culture. We're going to mention these again. The 7 mountains of culture: government, religion, media, family, business, education, arts, and entertainment. The religious vision and political aspirations of Ted Cruz and his father Raphael are widely known in conservative Christian religious and political circles and are being discussed in his home state of Texas. So much so that reporter Jonathan Tillove of the Austin American-Statesman wrote last summer about how Raphael Cruz was compelled to insist we are not talking about theocracy. Now what that means is they were talking about the Christian control of all these aspects of society so much that Ted Cruz's father had to argue we're not talking about theocracy. Theocracy is ruled by the religious, ruled by, for instance, priest or use something like Iran, for instance. That's a theocracy. The religious order has ultimate control. The Cruzes were talking about Christian control of government so much they had to start explaining we're not trying to create a theocracy here. They had to clear up that confusion. But historian John Fay reports that the Cruzes are close to Christian nationalist author, historical revisionist, and longtime Texas Republican leader David Barton, who declares that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, but has fallen away from this foundation and must be restored to avoid punishment from God. That's the line right there. We have fallen away from the Christian foundation and must be restored. This must be restored to avoid punishment from God. When you wonder why some Christians want to institute all these laws that line up with biblical teaching, It's to avoid punishment from God. Anyone who has watched Cruz on the stump knows that he often references the important role that his father, traveling evangelist Rafael Cruz, has played in his life. During a 2012 sermon at New Beginnings Church in Bedford, Texas, Rafael Cruz described his son's political campaign as a direct fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The elder Cruz told the congregation that God would anoint Christian kings to preside over end-time transfer of wealth from the wicked to the righteous. After this sermon, Larry Hutch, a pastor of New Beginnings, claimed Cruz's recent election to the U.S. Senate was a sign that he was one of these kings. According to his father and Hutch, Ted Cruz is anointed by God to help Christians in their effort to go to the marketplace and occupy the land and take dominion over it. This end-time transfer of wealth will relieve Christians of all financial woes, allowing true believers to ascend to a position of political and cultural power in which they can build a Christian civilization. When this Christian nation is in place, or back in place, Jesus will return. Fay also notes that Barton, who runs the Keep the Promise super PAC that supports Cruz's campaign, shares this vision. Barton's Christian nationalism is a product of this theological approach to culture. Back in 2011, Barton said that if Christians were going to successfully take the culture, they would need to control these 7 areas that I just mentioned earlier: government, religion, media, family, business, education, arts, and entertainment. If you can have those 7 areas, Barton told his listeners to his radio show, you can shape and control whatever takes place in nations, continents, even the world. So there, a long quote, but if I were to rewrite it, I'd be saying essentially the same thing. So why talk about this? I mean, admittedly, this is a small percentage of even the right-wing politics or conservative Christianity. Most of them are not Reconstructionists. Most of them are not Dominionists. But it is a movement that does exist. I know it exists because I've read the books. I know the names. And I know that one of them is running for president and is probably not going to win at this point, but still has an outside shot. So let that settle in. People in our congregation are surprised when I point out that many Christians don't want a wall of separating church and state. And by the way, this is true of other religions too. Islam clearly does not advocate for a separation of church and state in many of their countries. And this is also true in Hinduism and Buddhism. So it's not just a Christian thing. But since we live in America, that's what we're seeing here. So that's one of the reasons I want to talk about this. The wall that separates church and state is vital, and it is under attack. And I want you to understand why. We can't just assume that everyone thinks it's a good thing. There are people who think it's a horrible thing and must be torn down. We also need to be biblically literate, because the Bible drives the actions of many people in our country. And it's important to understand why they believe what they believe, why they do what they do, especially in the political realm where we're voting and trying to make decisions. I think Unitarian Universalism offers a couple of remedies, or at least hopes. First of all, the Bible must be read with historical understanding, and it must be read while applying common sense and reason. This was essentially the battle cry of the early Unitarians and Universalists. Faith and reason, faith and reason. You had to understand the historical context of the Bible in order to accurately interpret it. And you don't need to be afraid of that. And you don't need to say it's all perfectly inspired, because clearly it's not. And that's okay. It doesn't mean it doesn't have value. But you have to use your reason. And also, Unitarian Universalism advocates for a pluralistic society. And if we're going to advocate for that, we need to counter the arguments who want to emphasize one religion over all the others. Whether it be a Christian theocracy or a Muslim theocracy or any other theocracy, Unitarian Universalism emphasizes the important contributions of both many religions and many philosophies, many worldviews, not just one. There is a significant clash of worldviews going on in our country right now. On the one hand, we have the people who believe our country should be a Christian nation, that historically it was, and it needs to return to that, or God will punish us. For example, this quote from the National Day of Prayer Task Force, and the National Day of Prayer is on the 5th of this month, by the way, and this was written by Dave Butts. Hope-filled biblical focus is needed if we are to see a movement of prayer that moves the hand of God regarding the United States. Christians need to believe that God is not done with our nation, and that implies that God has been using our nation. God is not done with our nation, and begin praying with passion according to the purposes of God. The focus of our hope must be in God and His Word. This notion that there is a God, that God is deeply interested in humans, deeply interested in the United States, that God responds to prayer for our nation, these things drive the actions and the desires of many people in our country. This is the mission of the Day of Prayer Task Force. The mission of the National Day of Prayer Task Force is to mobilize prayer in America and encourage personal repentance and righteousness in culture. Righteousness in culture, in case you don't know what that means, includes opposition to such things as any form of abortion ever, opposition to the LGBT community, acknowledgement of the biblical God as the leader of our nation, the preeminence of Christianity, the importance of prayer in public institutions, amongst many other things. It is very important to state, again, that this is not a universal Christian view. It's generally on the conservative side of Christianity. There are plenty of Christians who are completely comfortable with other religious views or no religious views and have no desire to impose them on anyone else. But the ones you hear about are the ones making noise in the political realm. So that's what I'm referring to. And by the way, this whole National Day of Prayer thing that I just quoted, that's what our mayor in Tullahoma is part of, those Christian-only prayer sessions sponsored by the mayor. It is very important to understand that there is a subsection of Christianity that wants to Christianize our country, or at least our laws. They would never force you to be a Christian, but the laws should reflect biblical values. There is another worldview. There's a worldview that says each person in our country, and indeed the entire world, should be free to worship or think for themselves without governmental favoritism towards any particular view. Unitarian Universalism, our church, should seek to provide a safe and welcoming place for an exchange of ideas without advocating for only one. But it is equally true that each one of us will undoubtedly find some things that are more important than others in their life. And certain religions or philosophies or worldviews will appeal to you and others won't. And that's to be expected, and that's normal, and that's what we advocate for. What we hope is that despite these significant differences, we can come here and share these ideas, seeking to consciously and deliberately cultivate within ourselves a true willingness, not just superficial, but a true willingness to allow others to think differently, worship differently, and find meaning differently than we do. So seek not to impose your worldview on others, claim not to have exclusive truth, believe not that you are completely right and other views are completely wrong. Live humbly and always remain open to new insights. By this, may we bring peace to our world, and may it be so.